She's gone. The words crashed through Aria's mind like shattered glass as the officer avoided her eyes and slipped the final custody papers into her trembling hands, the ink still fresh, the judgment cruel and irreversible. Her arms still carried the warmth of her daughter's goodbye hug, but now they felt numb, cold, empty, hollowed by a loss so vicious, so deliberate, it left her frozen in place. Just steps away, Nathan, her ex-husband, stood like a conquering king, lips twisted into the kind of smug smile that only liars wear comfortably, holding little Ilara's hand like a trophy he'd stolen with forged evidence in courtroom theater. Ilara, sweet and innocent, glanced back with teary eyes and parted lips whispering, "Mama," but Nathan's grip tightened possessively, tugging her forward as if to sever that bond completely. Aria didn't collapse. She didn't scream or demand justice. Instead, she walked. Heels striking like gunshots across the marble floors of the courthouse, each step echoing not with defeat but with quiet, dangerous calculation. That night, under the suffocating darkness of her apartment, Aria didn't sleep. She didn't cry. She sat silently, staring at the wall, her face carved in stone. The world thought she had lost. But that night, something inside her snapped, not like a fragile twig, but like a steel cable under pressure finally breaking free. The woman Nathan once knew, the forgiving, soft-spoken, hopeful Aria, died that night. And from her ashes rose someone colder, smarter, and more lethal. She didn't want the law anymore. She wanted ruin. Not just for Nathan, but for everything he ever loved. The plan didn't come in one breath. It formed like frost, slow, creeping, and silent. Within weeks, Aria quit her job, sold everything that reminded her of her past life, and moved into a small, nondescript apartment in a part of town where no one asked questions. She adopted a new persona, cool, confident, unpredictable, and began researching Nathan's empire, the luxury car dealership, the investment partnerships, the public charity fronts that were little more than tax evasion disguises. She used burner phones, hired private investigators, and even got a job at one of his dealerships under a fake name just to observe his operations. Every day, she smiled in the face of oblivious managers and arrogant executives, filing paperwork by day, digging into dirty books by night. And then came the first strike. At 3:17 a.m., the night before a major investor visit, Nathan's flagship dealership went up in flames. Insurance called it a fault in the system. Nathan didn't buy it. Neither did the police. But they had no leads. Aria watched the fire from the shadows, her reflection flickering in the heat, a ghost reborn in vengeance. While Nathan scrambled to repair the damage, Aria was already on step 2, taking his future away before he even knew it was slipping. She reached out to Emma, Nathan's new fiancée, young, kind, naive, and inserted herself into her life like a trusted friend. As Marielle, she met Emma at yoga classes, cafe readings, and women's leadership groups. They bonded over books, men, and dreams, Aria playing her role so well that Emma never suspected the poison being poured into her world. On Emma's birthday, Aria gifted her a beautiful purse, inside it, a hidden flash drive containing screenshots, audio recordings, and bank transactions exposing Nathan's infidelities, emotional abuse, and financial manipulation. Within 72 hours, Emma was gone. She left no note, no public scandal, just vanished. Nathan's reputation took a quiet but noticeable hit. A few whisper articles began to surface. Board members raised eyebrows. And Aria, in the shadows, smiled again. But it still wasn't enough. She wanted more. She wanted Nathan to feel truly powerless. So she aimed higher. Over months, she carefully gathered financial data, offshore accounts, shell companies, investor bribes, and passed them anonymously to a tenacious journalist who had once been blackballed for trying to expose corruption in the auto industry. The journalist ran with it, articles exploded across the web, dragging Nathan's name into the mud. Still, he clung to arrogance, trying to sue, trying to spin, but the evidence was damning, and soon, tax authorities were knocking. Investors pulled out. Partners cut ties. Bank accounts froze. And then came the moment Aria had waited for. Nathan Hale, you are under arrest for fraud, tax evasion, and obstruction of justice. The cameras flashed, reporters shouted, and the once proud man who strutted through courtrooms was now in handcuffs, dragged from his office like a criminal, which he was. Aria watched from a distance, sunglasses low, lips unmoving, her heart ice calm. But even with Nathan in jail, she wasn't finished. The pain he caused her. The years of manipulation, the gaslighting, the lies, the stealing of her daughter, could not be undone with a single arrest. It needed to haunt him. So she began the final phase of her revenge. Every month, Nathan received a letter in prison. No words. Just a photo of Aria, happy, thriving, growing without him. At school, at dance recitals, with friends, blowing candles. Each picture was like a dagger in his heart, reminding him of the love he would never touch again. And finally, when Aria knew the weight of it all had settled fully upon him, when he was no longer a man but a hollow shell, she went to see him. The prison guard led her to the visitation booth where Nathan sat pale, sunken, and trembling. His eyes, once so confident, now held the look of a man who had stared into his own grave. I have nothing left, he whispered, tears threatening. You've taken everything. I lost my daughter, please, Aria. I was wrong. She stared at him in silence. Not hate. Not even satisfaction. Just stillness. Then she reached into her coat and placed one final photo on the glass. Aria at her piano recital, a gold medal around her neck. She's doing great, Aria said, her voice like cold marble. Better than ever. Nathan crumbled, sobbing, pressing his forehead to the glass as if trying to escape the cell that was now his world. Aria stood up. Adjusted her coat. Turned to leave. But before she did, she leaned in, whispered just loud enough for him to hear, You took my child. I took everything you ever loved. Now you finally understand what it means to lose what you can never get back. She walked out without looking back, her heels once again clicking like the tolling of a final bell, not of defeat, but of justice served. And as the prison gates shut behind her, she exhaled, not in relief, but in clarity. Her war was over. Not because she destroyed him, but because she rebuilt herself from the ashes he tried to bury her in. Flames swallowed the night sky like a beast awoken from centuries of slumber, and Aria sat silently in her rented car across the street, watching Nathan's multimillion-dollar dealership turn to smoke and ash, the reflection of the blaze dancing in her cold, unblinking eyes, not with fear, but with satisfaction. The fire marshal would later call it a system malfunction, but Nathan knew better the moment he arrived at the scene in his tailored coat, screaming into his phone with shaking hands, his perfect world cracking for the first time, and Aria, unseen in the shadows, marked it as her first victory, the first domino in a meticulously plotted war that he never saw coming. Months earlier, after he stole custody of their daughter Aria by poisoning the court with lies, paid off evaluations, and a lawyer who was once her best friend, Aria had disappeared from public view, only to re-emerge in silence and steel, no longer pleading for justice but promising vengeance, not through violence, but through brilliance, calculation, and quiet, creeping ruin. She started by gathering whispers, former employees of Nathan's dealership who had been wronged, scorned, silenced, or fired for daring to stand up to his predatory power plays. She met them in cafes, parking lots, bars where no one knew her name, collecting stories like precious stones, accounts of harassment, shady accounting, backdoor deals, and under-the-table bribes, evidence she would later package and deliver to the right inboxes like venom in envelopes, but at the time, her focus was on a woman named Emma, Nathan's fiancée. A soft-hearted graphic designer with dreams of owning an art cafe and no clue that the man she was about to marry was a narcissistic architect of destruction. Aria found her easily, Instagram posts, gallery appearances, charity brunches where she clung to Nathan like hope itself, and Aria slipped into her life as Marielle, a poised, wealthy marketing consultant who claimed to be between clients and cities. She inserted herself into Emma's world with masterful grace, attending the same yoga studio, frequenting the same organic coffee shop, accidentally spilling almond milk just to start a conversation, and within weeks they were exchanging favorite podcasts, deepest fears, and journal pages under the soft lighting of a vegan bistro, Emma confessing that sometimes Nathan frightened her when he drank too much or got angry about money, Aria nodding with practiced empathy, never revealing the storm behind her calm exterior. It was on Emma's birthday. After a long rooftop dinner under string lights and candle smoke, that Aria handed her a beautiful purse as a gift, inside which she'd sewn a flash drive so discreet it felt like part of the design, and on that flash drive, bank records showing Nathan's offshore accounts, screenshots of flirtatious late-night texts to escorts, manipulative emails mocking Emma's insecurities to his friends, and a secret prenup draft that would have left her with nothing had they married, was the slow death of his future. Emma disappeared 3 days later, no phone call, no letter, just vanished like she never existed, and the silence she left behind echoed louder than any confrontation, with investors asking questions, gossip sites speculating about infidelity, and Nathan forced to issue a statement he didn't believe, all while Aria, still, Marielle, watched it unfold over morning espresso and a casual smirk. But Emma was just one brick in the fortress she intended to demolish, and Aria's next target was his money, his pride, the illusion of control he used to dominate every room he walked into. For weeks she hacked away at his facade, sending anonymous tips to financial crime units, hiring a discreet investigator to trace fraudulent transactions between Nathan's charity foundation and his private travel account, and collecting screenshots of misfiled taxes that even his accountant was too scared to report. The press got hold of it through an ex-journalist named Keller whom Aria had met years ago at a fundraiser and quietly resurrected from career death by giving him the scoop of his life. Nathan's empire cracked like old marble, one board member stepped down, another filed a lawsuit, and his dealership shares plummeted overnight. Yet he still clung to control, hosting press conferences with a forced grin, denying every accusation, blaming internal sabotage, completely unaware that the saboteur had kissed his daughter goodnight and tucked her in just 2 years ago. But Aria wasn't finished. Trembling before her, tears began to fall before he could even speak. "I know what I did," he said. "I was trying to win, and I lost everything. Please. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her But Aria raised her hand and stopped him, reached into her coat, and placed the final photo between them, Aria on stage at her recital, golden light behind her, proud and radiant, and said softly, "She doesn't need your apologies. She doesn't even ask about you anymore." Nathan sobbed openly then, and Aria leaned forward with the calm of a woman who had walked through fire and rebuilt herself in the flames, whispering, "You took my child. I took everything you ever loved. Now you understand what it feels like to lose something you can never buy back." She stood, eyes never breaking contact, and walked away without another word, the guards opening the gates like a passage out of hell, and as the sun kissed her face on the prison steps, she didn't smile, didn't cry. She just breathed, for the first time in years, like a woman who had been buried alive and dug her way out with bare hands and sharpened will, not to destroy, but to reclaim what was hers, piece by piece, until the world remembered her not as a victim, but as the storm that left nothing standing. "Nathan Hale, you're under arrest." The word split the silence of his glass-walled office like a hammer through porcelain, and in that moment, as he stood frozen in his $1,000 suit with federal agents swarming behind him and reporters pressing against the window like vultures sensing blood, he looked around for someone to save him, but there was no one left, not Emma, not his lawyer, not his investors, not even the daughter whose custody he had so proudly stolen 2 years earlier, and definitely not Aria, who stood just outside the chaos in the crowd, sunglasses sliding low on her nose, arms folded across a dark coat, lips curled into a smile that wasn't angry, but satisfied, still, poised, because this was the moment she had been building toward in silence, brick by calculated brick, ever since he lied, cheated, and manipulated his way into taking her only child, Aria, away from her, branding Aria unstable and unfit, gaslighting her in court until even she began to doubt her sanity. Until the judge ruled in his favor and handed their daughter over to a monster with charm and money but no heart. Aria didn't scream then, she didn't collapse, she vanished, but not in defeat, in strategy, in evolution, in rebirth, and she emerged months later as a ghost in his shadow, unnoticed, unrecognizable, invisible yet everywhere, gathering every crumb of dirt he thought he had swept away, every crooked wire transfer, every offshore account, every shell company, every NDAs from silenced women he thought he had buried in legal noise. And she fed them like poisoned fruit to a journalist desperate for redemption, to a forensic accountant with a grudge. And to an investigator who knew what it felt like to have everything taken by a rich man who thought laws were for other people. Nathan didn't notice the walls closing in. He was too busy firefighting his brand after his dealership mysteriously burned down, too busy managing PR after Emma disappeared without a trace and took half of his credibility with her, never realizing Aria had infiltrated Emma's life under a new name, played friend, handed her the truth gift wrapped in kindness, and watched her vanish with all the grace of a woman dodging a bullet. The arrest wasn't the beginning of the end, it was the middle of the unraveling, because prison was just the place where Nathan would finally have the time to understand the cost of what he had done, not just to Aria, but to the daughter he used like a pawn in a power game, and while the prison bars were physical, the torment was emotional, because Aria didn't stop once he was locked away. Instead, she began sending letters, one every week, each containing a photo of Aria smiling, growing, living a life filled with joy, freedom, music, and love, without him. Birthday cakes with too many candles to count, violin recitals with standing ovations, handmade crafts with "Mom" in glitter glue, but never "Dad," never even a question about him, and that was what shattered him piece by piece, week after week, 1,000 paper cuts that reminded him he didn't just lose Aria, he lost legacy, presence, memory, and eventually, even identity. The guards at the prison began to notice the change. Nathan, once proud and cold, became quiet and haunted, a man haunted. Not by the crimes that brought him there but by the photo of a little girl who no longer needed him, whose world had continued, and thrived, without his influence. A year into his sentence, he broke, finally requesting a visitor not from his lawyer, not from the court, but from Aria, the woman he tried to destroy, the woman who had rebuilt herself with fire in her lungs and ice in her veins, and when she walked into that sterile prison room, dressed in black like the ghost of his past mistakes, he couldn't even lift his eyes at first, ashamed not because he was caught, but because he had failed to kill the spirit he tried to crush. "I have nothing left," he whispered when he finally spoke, eyes hollow, voice trembling, hands folded like a prayer he didn't know how to finish. "You've taken everything, the money, the company, the press, Emma, her," and Aria sat across from him, completely still, watching him with the calmness of a woman who had buried her grief long ago and planted something sharp in its place, and then she reached into her coat, pulled out one final photo, and slid it across the table, Aria standing under golden stage lights, holding a music award, pride beaming from her small face, and behind her, no father, no Nathan, only her mother, Aria, hand resting on her daughter's shoulder, both smiling, whole. "She's perfect," Aria said softly, and Nathan's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the picture like it was a window to a life he could never return to. "She's safe. She's smart. She's happy. And she doesn't ask about you anymore. You don't exist in her bedtime stories. You don't show up in her drawings. You're a ghost, Nathan. A shadow. That's your legacy now." He covered his face and sobbed, no longer a CEO, no longer a man in control, but a broken echo of who he once pretended to be, and Aria leaned forward, voice now sharper, deliberate, final. "You took my child. You tried to take my sanity. You almost erased me. But I didn't fight back with fists or lawyers. I watched. I waited. I learned. And then I took everything you ever loved. Not in anger, but in balance. That's not revenge, Nathan. That's justice." She stood to leave, and as the guard approached, Nathan lifted his tear-streaked face and begged, voice cracking, "Tell her I'm sorry. Please. Just let her know I loved her." Aria paused, tilted her head slightly, and without turning back, replied, "She knows who loves her. And she knows who doesn't." And with that, she walked away, leaving behind not just a man in chains, but a man buried in the wreckage of his own cruelty, while outside, the sun greeted her with warmth, the world silent and calm as she slipped into her car, slid off her sunglasses, and whispered to herself the words that had lived inside her for 2 years, "It's over. He can't hurt us anymore." But she didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel elated. She felt, restored, whole, standing not as the woman he tried to erase, but as the mother who rose from ash, weaponized silence, and proved that the quietest storms often leave the deepest scars. The moment Nathan opened the letter and saw the photo of his daughter, Aria, smiling brightly, holding a first-place trophy in a music recital he hadn't even known she attended, standing beside a woman he tried to erase from both their lives, he dropped to his knees on the cold cement floor of his prison cell, shaking, because that moment wasn't just about a picture, it was a sentence, a mirror, a slap from the past that whispered, "You've already lost everything," and as his trembling hands clutched the photo like a lifeline, reality sank in. Aria had won, not by violence or vengeance in its crude form, but by strategy, silence, and a storm disguised as patience, and now, the same man who once testified against her in court, who paid off a psychiatrist to label her unstable, who stood with smug confidence as he was granted full custody of their daughter, was now nothing more than a broken echo of power, weeping in a cell with no one left to manipulate. And outside, Aria stood beneath the pale winter sun, watching the world go on as if it owed her nothing, but she didn't care, because she hadn't waited for the world's justice, she had delivered her own, and it all began the day she lost custody, the day the courtroom doors slammed shut behind her like a coffin sealing hope inside, the day Nathan smirked at her as Aria clung to his hand in confusion, not knowing that her mother hadn't been deemed unfit, but outmaneuvered, set up, and shattered from within. Aria disappeared after that, not physically, but spiritually, no social media, no contact, not even with her parents, and for a full year, Nathan believed he had won, believed she had crawled away into obscurity while he painted himself as the loving, responsible father to a child he viewed more as leverage than life. But what he didn't know was that Aria had spent every waking moment of that year becoming something he couldn't predict, a silent weapon, a mother forged in grief, someone who no longer wanted to beg for justice, but to become it. And her first step wasn't rage, it was information. She studied Nathan, his businesses, his habits, the way he talked to people, the way he lied, how he funneled dealership funds into shell charities and cheated employees out of overtime, and slowly, she built a map, not just of his fraud, but of his weaknesses. She found the people he'd wronged, old employees, ex-girlfriends, former clients, and offered them something Nathan never had: empathy, honesty, and the promise that their stories would finally be heard. And one by one, they gave her everything: documents, photos, receipts, secrets whispered over coffee and in alleyways, until Aria held enough power to crush him from 10 directions. But power wasn't enough, she wanted to dismantle him, emotionally, financially, socially, and most of all, intimately. So she reinvented herself, using a new name, a polished corporate persona, and re-entered his world through his new fiancée, Emily, who had no idea that the elegant, confident Aria, who became her business mentor and brunch companion, was the very woman her fiancé had called crazy. Aria never rushed, she played the long game, feeding Emily doubt, exposing Nathan's subtle cruelty, the way he controlled her clothing, mocked her ambitions, gaslight her until she believed she was overreacting, and then, on Emily's birthday, Aria handed her a flash drive and whispered, "Only open this if he ever makes you feel small again." And 3 weeks later, Emily disappeared, canceling the wedding, emptying their shared account, and leaving behind a trail of whispers that damaged Nathan's public image beyond repair. Aria didn't stop there, she reported his tax fraud anonymously, leaked internal dealership documents to investigative reporters, and orchestrated an audit that ended with frozen assets, fleeing investors, and public humiliation. Nathan's empire crumbled like a sandcastle under a rising tide, but the worst hadn't even begun, because as he scrambled to salvage what little was left, Aria quietly began documenting everything: his threats, his panic, his spiraling mental state, and when he tried to file a restraining order against the unknown Aria, she submitted all her evidence to the court, anonymously, indirectly, and through a lawyer she'd once interned with, who owed her everything. the authorities began investigating, and by the time Nathan was finally arrested, charged with tax evasion, corporate fraud, and perjury, he was already a man unraveling, abandoned by his board, deserted by his fiancée, and completely unaware that the woman orchestrating his downfall had once begged him in tears to let her say goodnight to their daughter one last time. Prison was just the final cage, but Aria's real masterpiece was what came after. Every week, she sent him a photo of Aria, each one more beautiful than the last. A living reminder of what he had tried to take, each moment a stolen memory he could never reclaim, her. Winning a school award, playing the violin, laughing with friends, standing in front of a Christmas tree, hugging her mother, and with every photo, Nathan sank deeper into regret, because he knew now that Aria hadn't taken revenge to hurt him, she had taken everything he loved so he could understand loss in its purest form, the kind that no apology, no amount of money, and no illusion of control could fix. The guards began to notice how Nathan stopped eating, how he stared at the wall for hours, how he flinched when the mail came, and eventually, how he stopped reading the letters altogether, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. And then, 1 year into his sentence, he finally asked to see her, not through his lawyer, but face to face, like a man who needed to see the storm that had devoured him. And Aria, wearing the same black dress she wore to court the day she lost everything, walked into the sterile visitation room with the grace of someone who had already won long ago. Nathan was no longer the man she remembered. His hair graying, eyes sunken, hands trembling with guilt, and he couldn't speak at first, but when he finally did, his voice cracked like ice. "I'm sorry, Aria. I didn't know. I didn't think you'd ever come back from it." And she just looked at him, not with hate, but with calm detachment, like someone observing the ruins of a once great building, and she slid the last photo across the table, Aria on stage, lit by golden spotlight, smiling with the kind of joy no court could fake, no money could buy, and whispered, "You took my child. I took everything you ever loved. We're even now." Nathan broke down then, hands covering his face, sobbing like a child, but Aria didn't flinch. She stood, nodded once to the guard, and walked out, not needing his pain to feel victorious, but simply relieved that justice, however delayed, had arrived not through a gavel, but through fire, strategy, and a mother's unstoppable will.